cunts.
Laci here. It is a sweaty LA night, the perfect time to talk about trigger warnings.
It's daytime. Daytime.
There's been a bunch of, verbal vomit
On your channel, in general?
about trigger warnings the past year or so. Most recently, the University of Chicago released this letter to incoming freshmen. They said, quote, "Our commitment to academic freedom means we don't support so-called trigger warnings, we don't cancel invited speakers because their topics might prove controversial, and we don't condone the creation of intellectual safe spaces where individuals can retreat from ideas and perspectives at odds with their own."
Well then, good for them. It's about time that they had a backbone. I mean, think of it this way. Someone goes into a math course and they think that 2 plus 0 equals 3. And they need a trigger warning before every class, and they need a safe space because they are triggered by people telling them that they're wrong and correcting them. Why would you put up with that? That's really stupid. And if you do put up with it, that would do some serious damage if they use the math degree to go into engineering or being a doctor. Stuff that it would actually affect that you need to be right in. If you look at the syllabus of a class and you go into the class, then you need to put up with the stuff in that class. Why would you go into the class otherwise if you know what they're teaching? And this is coming from experience, unfortunately. I mean, it took me a really long time to be able to read a scene that had sexual assault or rape in it. But I managed to get over it and do that. I managed to expose myself to those things that had that kind of thing in it very, very slowly, little bit by little bit, until I got rid of all these trigger warnings and that kind of thing. It's the only reason that I'm actually able to function as a human being right now. Otherwise, I would have probably just killed myself a long time ago. If you continuously cushion yourself and make yourself more and more fragile, the fragility and the sensitivity that you have becomes impossible to keep up with. It becomes impossible to maintain that kind of safety, and you ended up just breaking apart. Trigger warnings look like they mean well, and in some cases they kind of do for a little while, but they are really, really dangerous in the long run.
The problem with this statement.
So it's problematic. I think I just got cancer from that word. Do you see the pain that I go through to entertain the people at home? If you want to send me something as a thank you, here's my P.O. box on the screen right now.
Is the same problem with a lot of critiques of trigger warnings on the internet.
Is that they tell you to toughen up and get over it?
And that's not what a trigger warning is.
Well, yeah, the university letter didn't exactly define trigger warnings, but they did list things that are a direct consequence of trigger warnings or go hand in hand with trigger warnings. Stuff that if you start introducing it and there's more and more of a demand for it, you're going to get those things eventually. There's controversial content. You can't have this person here anymore. Let's just ban all of the things that have to have trigger warnings in front of them. That's what happens. It's one of those things where, in theory, the definition of this thing is good, but if you actually apply it, you're not taking into account the fact that humans are different and it's not going to work in reality. And you can keep insisting again and again, like, this is the definition, this is what this is. If you keep adding more and more trigger warnings, this is what you end up with. People get really, really sensitive because nothing is being challenged and they're not getting stronger and going and getting over everything. And they just start banning stuff that they don't agree with. That's what happens. That's why you can't really start with it in the first place. And I hope it's not one of those instances where you just keep hammering on and on about the definition, despite what's happening. Despite the fact that the definition evolves to other things, to mean other things to suit the new time.
It is not a retreat from ideas and perspectives. If it is actually being used in that way, then the trigger warning is being misused.
Well, I guess everyone is misusing it then. It's kind of weird then that we have some sort of unknown definition for this word that everyone happens to be getting wrong. Funny that.
I first became aware of trigger warnings when I was in college, but it was not in class, it was during an internship. I was working with domestic abuse survivors at a state agency. Trigger warnings exist to give someone a little bit of a buffer before confronting them with information, graphics, whatever that may be deeply painful and upsetting.
Yes, that's the point with my story about myself. It's just a buffer. A buffer is not meant to be there all the time. A buffer is just for when you go and get help in the places that you need to get help for sexual abuse, domestic abuse, all of that. And it helps you along a little bit, but you can't use the buffer all the time. The reason you go to get help at these places is to cope so that you don't need to be there anymore, so that you can go into the real world. If we pacify and baby-proof the entire world, then why the fuck would you need to go to those places to cope? The only reason that those places have trigger warnings is because the fragile people are going there to try and cope, to build themselves up again. That's why those places need to be very sensitive and very caring and nurturing, and they need to have trigger warnings. But that's all that's for. If the entire world was just as pacified and as baby-proofed as you'd like, then we wouldn't really need those places.
They are specifically used in populations which may be experiencing higher levels of trauma to help them cope, compartmentalize, and keep moving forward.
That's the point that people are trying to make. Trigger warnings are only there for a limited amount of time to help buffer a little bit, and as you expose yourself more and more to those things and get over it more and more, gradually, over time, you need less of a buffer until you don't need one at all. So why would you go and put one in a university when the point of a university is to challenge and strengthen and grow a young person? Why would you do that? Why would you just leave them in their own little cocoon when that's the opposite of what a university should be? And again, I've been through that too. I really hated the fact that I had to go through all of these things to get over it, but now I'm a much happier person because I'm strong enough to. And I used to hate just seeing all the stuff about violence and rape scenes and all that sort of stuff, and it was horrible. But now that I get over it, I can appreciate literature, and A Clockwork Orange is actually one of my favorite novels. So it does get so much better. And it does ruin a lot of things just to have them all listed on the front. I mean, some art and some literature, the message that they need to give is completely ruined. The creative control is completely just taken away and ruined by the fact that you have to list all the trigger warnings at the front. Oh, I'm sorry if you're offended by this. Look, the reason that people are using the phrase trigger warning is because that's what the people that we're calling out use. The reason that we'd call people feminists that you don't consider feminists is because they call themselves that.
Now, I think where things got a little bit more complex and thus more controversial is when they were translated for usage in the blogosphere. Now you have online communities that want very specific trigger warnings, people talking about very specific things. I don't think it's up to me to say, oh, people overuse trigger warnings or whatever. But I do think the demand for really specific trigger warnings in very general settings has been used to undermine the legitimacy and value of trigger warnings as a whole.
Okay, this is where most people kind of go, yeah, trigger warnings are really stupid in this area. That's kind of the point. Tumblr has some really stupid trigger warnings that they're really, really serious about, to the point where they'll go harass people and be really, really mean to people just because of the sake of those stupid trigger warnings. That's kind of the point. Not many people, well, the majority of people in society kind of know the difference between people who've gone through stuff and need a slight buffer that will gradually go away over time, and then people who just need stupid stuff like in Tumblr. But the issue is that trigger warnings have kind of evolved into more of the Tumblr stuff. And that's exactly the point. That's the entire issue. There is kind of a discussion that needs to be had though, because on one hand you can say, yeah, Tumblr needs to get over it, but on the other hand you're saying that trigger warnings are kind of a buffer for people who've been through more serious things, but it's kind of I think it's okay for these people to have that buffer for their entire lives. And it's not. The buffer is there for the start, but then you need to get over it over time. And I think that's where a lot of people are arguing. I think that it's okay for people to have a little bit of a leeway, but then after a while you need to start coping. Otherwise, therapy is not helping you, and going through all that's not helping you. And I really think that that's where trigger warnings kind of go into a gray area, because I don't think that trigger warnings should be in universities, and you're kind of just inconveniencing other people. And the inevitable conclusion of banning things is inconveniencing people who can now not access that literature or learn those things because the ideas are just being banned, because they're too controversial and because they violate a trigger warning. Now, if you continue along that train of thought of what you just said about delegitimizing all of these things, I agree with that. That's basically it. That's pretty sound logic. And I think if you kept going along that train of thought instead of all that wishy-washy stuff in the beginning, you might have a pretty good point.
Another observation worth noting is that trigger warnings are part of a broader ideology where people's experiences and people's needs are taken into account. It's more of a nurturing culture. Trigger warnings and the culture that surrounds them runs directly contradictory to hyper masculinity, where everyone's tough and we make fun of people who are weak little pussy crybabies.
And you ruined it. This is like that argument you get when you're growing up, and it's like, some people say that men don't cry, but it's okay if men cry. And you always hear the some people say, but you never really hear the actual people that are mentioned saying men don't cry. You can hear it in tiny little pockets around the globe, you can hear it in very few people, but the majority of society, when they tell you some people say, they act like it's this massive problem that every single boy grows up with the men don't cry kind of message beat into them. And it's not really the case. The majority of society does know that people go through things and sometimes you can have a hard time trying to cope afterwards. A lot of people know that. There are very few people who actually say, get over it, you pussy crybaby. You're making it sound like it's a massive issue. And what's the deal with the masculinity thing? It's always linked back to demonizing masculinity, like, oh yeah, it's masculinity. Just link that at the bottom of every single bad thing. And we got it. That's what it is. Because people see masculinity and femininity as one has to be above the other one. And because masculinity is just put above the others, it needs to be beat down. It's not like that. These two things complement each other. They are the puzzle pieces that fit together, that are needed for society. You take away one and the other one can't deal by itself. Not everything has to be this have and have not kind of system. You don't have to liberate everything. Some things just fit together. Not everything is just like this. Just because you put masculinity above yourself and then feel the need to knock it down, doesn't mean everyone else does. So stop demonizing masculinity. It's not working.
The backlash to trigger warnings isn't necessarily sexist, but I think that it is fueled by sexism. Okay,
Wait, what? I love how you go into extreme detail about all of these random other obvious things, like the definition of trigger warning. But when it comes to something actually interesting that you have to explain, you're just like, no, this is sexism, isn't it? Okay. And you just don't explain anything. How is this a sexist issue? You're just assuming that most women are victims? Isn't that very sexist of you to assume that most women are victims? Like we're not strong enough? I think that's very sexist of you, Laci. You need to check your privilege.
Almost done with my very tired rant.
Your tired rants make me want to sleep. Forever.
I'm going to end on what I actually agree with the Dean on, and that's that controversial speakers, short of hate speech, should not be banned from speaking at universities.
Yeah, hate speech. You had me until hate speech. What is the definition of hate speech? Who is the arbiter of defining what hate speech is? What if the people who are banning a controversial speaker think that that speaker has hate speech? And if so, why is your definition of hate speech worth more than their definitions of hate speech? This is the problem with hate speech. It's such a vague term that anyone can claim anything as hate speech, and you can't argue with them because there's no clear definition of what it is enough to prove them wrong. Your entire point pretty much contradicts itself when you say hate speech. Hate speech, a lot of the time, the definition is just built on feelings. So how can you determine what is hate speech and what is not?
That's ridiculous. Censorship is not the answer to social justice problems.
I think you may have just contradicted yourself there, Laci.
Short of hate speech, I am intimately familiar with this issue because I have been targeted for censorship. Alright, those are my thoughts. I definitely want to know what you all think.
I don't think anyone who's willingly in your audience can think.
Actually, some data to suggest that this whole trigger warnings on campus panic is completely overblown in the first place. Like, not a lot of people are actually complaining about this.
Yes, no one mandates trigger warnings. Just because it's not mandated doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. Doesn't mean that the people, the teachers, can look at their content and go, okay, we're banning this. I mean, just look at how many places good old Milo, your slop of the Papadopoulos got banned from. And I kind of noticed a bit of a pattern here. Like, whenever it's a problem that you identify, it's always this massive thing that happens every day. Like, every single woman is being a victim of sexism every single day. Rape culture is affecting everyone every single day. Oh, false rape accusations? What are you talking about? That's just a small problem that doesn't even happen that often. Trigger warnings? That's just being blown out of proportion. That doesn't even happen that often. Why are we even having this conversation? Why do you think it's a problem? My problems, though, they are a big deal. They should have laws against them. Comedy is not funny. Just wrapping up my opinion, I think that trigger warnings shouldn't just be eradicated completely. I mean, there's always this kind of polarizing attitude when people get into heated debates. It's like, oh, you don't like trigger warnings? That means that you just hate them all and you want to ban them all. Oh, you say that you don't mind trigger warnings? That means that you want them everywhere. On both sides, I guess. we can identify that there is a problem. Just because someone's solution to a problem is wrong, or you think it's wrong, it doesn't mean that there isn't a problem to begin with. We can find common ground on things, it's just how we approach them that's different. Just because someone doesn't have one opinion, doesn't mean that their opinion is the polar opposite of that. And that's where I think a lot of arguments come from. The people who are saying that they don't like trigger warnings, and the people in universities who are not putting up with trigger warnings, aren't saying that they're just inherently evil things. They're just saying that a lot of the time it just escalates to so much harmful kind of behavior, like banning everything, being like a Puritan, and purging things that you don't agree with, staying in a bubble and being hostile and intolerant to everyone, that you can't really have trigger warnings in those places, and it defeats the purpose of going somewhere to cope. People aren't really saying that trigger warnings should be banned, we're just saying that they're being used way too much. And just because you've been through something terrible doesn't mean that you should be treated specially, doesn't mean that you should continuously never have to face anything like that again. That doesn't mean that I would have to just sit in my bubble and never have to face any of the things that would trigger me before. And yeah, that's kind of my point, in as many words I could say it in. Sometimes I have to make things a bit broad, because otherwise I'd be sitting here for like 5 hours trying to make a point. There's just such a gray area sometimes, it's kind of hard to say everything and not miss out on a couple things. So I usually just respond to what I hear in a video instead of actually bringing everything up. I think it's a bit easier that way, I guess. And what has happened to common sense these days? It's like it's become some sort of sickness.
Get up, come on, get down with the sickness.